She walked into the boardroom bleeding through her silence, and the most dangerous man in Chicago felt something crack open in his chest that 20 years of murder had never touched. If you've ever loved someone who made you want to burn the whole world down just to keep them safe, stay with me. This is the story of Nolan Varick and Clara Elowin, a man built from concrete and violence, a woman who survived by disappearing, and the moment one bruise shaped like a stranger's hand changed everything between them. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it grips you, hit that like button before we're done. The rain came in sideways off Lake Michigan, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack, driving horizontal sheets that turned the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor into a solid wall of white noise and pressure. It had been raining since 4 in the morning. It was now 9:30, and inside the boardroom of Varick Capital, the temperature had nothing to do with weather. Nolan Varick stood at the head of a table long enough to park a car on, his back to the windows, his hands loose at his sides. He was 41 years old and built like something that had survived a lot of things it shouldn't have. Wide across the shoulders, deep-chested, with a jaw that had taken its share of hits and never learned to stay soft. His suit was charcoal, Italian, probably worth more than the monthly salary of every person sitting at his table combined. He wore it the way a man wears body armor, not for vanity, but because appearances in his world were weapons, and he never went anywhere unarmed. The man in the chair across from him was sweating through his shirt collar. His name was Dennis Farrow. Port Authority, Commissioner, 12-year career, 3 commendations from the mayor's office, and, as of 48 hours ago, a name on a list that Nolan's people had pulled from a compromised server in a shipping container that never officially arrived at Pier 17. Farrow was 62, soft in the middle, with the permanently flushed complexion of a man who drank too much and slept too little and had been telling himself for years that the things he was doing were not as bad as they looked. They were worse. "I want to be clear about something," Nolan said. His voice was very low. That was the thing people never expected. They expected volume, aggression, the kind of performance that filled rooms. Nolan had learned 20 years ago that the quieter he got, the more room the other person's fear had to grow. "I'm not here to have a conversation with you. I'm here to watch you decide whether the next 5 minutes go one way or another way." Farrow's hands were flat on the table. He'd been told to keep them flat. He was trying very hard to comply. "Mr. Varick, I don't know what you think you have, but I have 17 months of wire transfers routed through a shell in Gdansk." Nolan didn't move. "I have your signature on 6 cargo manifests that list equipment that wasn't on the ships. I have a conversation, recorded, clear audio, between you and a logistics coordinator named Fen Solis, in which you use the words, 'Make sure the Varick containers don't get flagged.' You said his name twice. You used my name once." He paused. I found that particularly interesting. The room was very quiet. There were 4 other people present. 2 of Nolan's lawyers, a security consultant named Dre, who stood near the door with his arms crossed and his face carefully blank, and Marek Vale, who sat in the far corner with his ankle crossed over his knee and a paper cup of coffee balanced on his thigh, like he was watching something mildly entertaining on television. Mark was 50 years old, black-haired going gray at the temples, with a long, angular face that had the kind of stillness in it that came from genuinely not caring what most people thought of him. He had been Nolan's underboss for 11 years. Before that, he had been Nolan's enforcer. Before that, in a city that neither of them talked about anymore, he had been the man who taught Nolan that sentiment was the fastest way to bleed out in this business. Mark was the closest thing Nolan had to a brother. He was watching Farrow the way a man watches a bug he hasn't decided whether to kill yet. I can explain the manifest," Farrow started. "I'm not interested in your explanation." Nolan pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat down, unhurried, and picked up the glass of water in front of him. He drank, set it down. "I'm interested in the name of whoever approached you, whoever made the first contact, whoever told you that running interference on my containers was a service worth providing." Farrow's mouth opened. "Before you tell me you don't know what I'm talking about," Nolan continued, "I want you to consider something. I have a man, you've never seen him, you never will, whose entire job is document recovery. He's been working for 3 days. What he's found so far is enough to end your career, your pension, your marriage, and your freedom, in roughly that order. What he hasn't found yet, he's still looking for. He set both hands on the table, flat and still, mirroring Pharaoh's posture almost exactly. So the question isn't whether I have something on you. The question is whether what I have is the whole picture or only part of it, and whether you'd like to give me the rest voluntarily, or whether you'd prefer I find it on my own and draw my own conclusions about why you felt the need to make me work for it. The rain hammered the glass. Pharaoh's collar had gone from damp to visibly wet. He was doing the math. Nolan could see it happening, the slow, nauseating arithmetic of a man calculating how far in he actually was, and whether the door he thought he'd been edging toward had been locked the entire time. There was a man, Pharaoh said finally. His voice had lost its shape. I never got a real name. He came to me through an intermediary, a lawyer, someone from the Port Authority Board. He said there were shipments, high value, that they needed to move clean, that the arrangement would be... He stopped, swallowed. Profitable. What did the shipments contain? I don't know. I never asked. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. That's the first honest thing you've said since you sat down. He leaned back. You're going to write down every name you remember, every meeting location, dates, if you have them. You're going to sign a document that my lawyers have prepared which outlines your cooperation and the terms under which that cooperation guarantees you a very quiet, very private exit from your current position. He glanced at one of the lawyers, who slid a folder across the table without being asked. Or you can walk out of this building and be on the front page of every paper in Chicago within 72 hours. Not for the containers. For something older that I've been sitting on for 2 years, waiting for a reason to use it. He watched Pharaoh's face. I found my reason. It wasn't a bluff, exactly. It was a door. Nolan had been opening doors like this for 20 years, standing just far enough inside them that the other person couldn't see what was behind him, only the shape of the choice. Pharaoh reached for the pen. The door opened behind Nolan. He didn't turn around immediately. He watched Marek's eyes flick to the door and back, watched the security consultant shift his weight almost imperceptibly, and then he turned. Clara Elowin was standing in the doorway. She was 31 years old and built for disappearing. Medium height, slight frame, the kind of woman who moved through spaces like she was apologizing for existing in them. She kept her dark hair pinned up at work, always, in ways that seemed designed to take up as little visual real estate as possible. Her clothes were professional and unremarkable. Today a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, dark slacks. She wore flats. She wore the same narrow watch she always wore. She was Nolan's executive secretary, had been for 2 years, and in that time he had watched her become invisibly essential to the functioning of his legitimate operations. The kind of person who remembered every detail, anticipated every need, and communicated all of it in a voice kept carefully at half volume, as if she'd learned early that being quiet was the safest way to be present. She was 20 minutes late. She was never late. Nolan clocked this in the same half second he clocked everything else. The slight drag in her step, the way she was holding herself just slightly off-center, the tension around her mouth that she was working hard to smooth into a normal expression. She had her tablet pressed against her chest with both hands, which was unusual. She normally carried it at her side. She looked up, found his eyes, and immediately looked down. "I'm so sorry," she said. Her voice was steady, almost. "I'm sorry, I should have... It's fine," he said. She blinked. He didn't say things like that. He said you're late and what happened and I needed you here at 9. Not because he was cruel, but because he was precise, and precision had served him better than kindness in every room he'd ever been in. She looked almost more unsettled by the dismissal than she would have been by a rebuke. She moved to the far side of the room and opened her tablet and began pulling up the files she'd been asked to prepare for the post-meeting documentation, standing near the credenza with her back 3/4 to the room. Nolan turned back to Pharaoh, watched him finish signing the document, let the lawyer collect the folder, said 4 more sentences, instructions, timelines, a quiet reminder that silence was now both in Pharaoh's interest and professionally required, and stood up. The meeting was over. Pharaoh was escorted out by the security consultant. The lawyers gathered their materials. Marek unfolded himself from his chair and stood, finishing the last of his coffee, and raised an eyebrow at Nolan. A shorthand they'd developed over a decade that meant clean or complicated. Nolan tilted his chin slightly. Clean for now. Mark nodded once and walked out. The room was empty except for Nolan and Clara. She was still at the credenza, organizing files on her tablet, and she still had both arms wrapped around herself in a way that looked, from the outside, like she was cold. The building's climate control was aggressive. People complained about it sometimes. It wasn't unusual. Except that it wasn't cold in the room. The meeting had generated enough body heat and tension to warm it considerably. Nolan walked toward the windows, stopped, looked at the rain. Clara, I have the Mercer files ready for the 3 o'clock. She didn't look up. And the alderman's office called again about the community development proposal. I've drafted a response for your review but haven't sent it. I wanted to confirm the revised budget figures with accounting first. Clara. She stopped talking. He turned from the windows. She was standing very still, tablet at her chest, and the particular quality of her stillness was the thing that confirmed what he'd been tracking since the moment she walked through the door. It wasn't the stillness of calm. It was the stillness of someone who'd gotten good at not moving because movement hurt. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her. She was looking at a point somewhere near his left shoulder, which was how she usually looked at him. Adjacent, careful, as if direct eye contact with Nolan Varick was a form of exposure she'd learned to avoid. Look at me. She did. Her eyes were dark brown, and they had the kind of quality that all of her had. Professionally contained, every feeling pushed back behind a very competent wall. But the wall had a crack in it today. Just one. She was tired in a way that a night of bad sleep didn't explain, and under the concealer along her jaw there was a shadow of something that, in different light, would have looked like bruising. What happened to your face? He said. I fell. Fast. Too fast. This morning, the parking garage, the floor is wet when it rains, and I wasn't paying attention. He didn't say anything. She felt the silence do exactly what he intended it to do. Mr. Varick, your tablet. He held out his hand. She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Then she held it out to him. She hadn't been holding it against her chest for warmth or habit. When she lowered it, her left forearm was visible below the rolled cuff of her blazer. The blouse underneath had a longer sleeve, but where the blazer ended and the blouse began, there was a gap. And in that gap, against the pale inside of her forearm, there was a bruise. Dark. Deep layered. The kind of mark that doesn't come from a fall. It was shaped like 4 fingers. Nolan's jaw moved once. That was the only visible thing that changed in him. Everything else, his voice, his posture, the temperature of the room, remained absolutely controlled. He set the tablet on the credenza. Roll up your sleeve. Mr. Varick, Clara. The word was very quiet. Roll it up. She did. The bruise wrapped around her forearm from the inside to the outer edge. 4 distinct pressure marks on one side and the deep bloom of a thumb on the other, as if someone had grabbed her arm with the specific targeted intent of making it impossible to pull free. It was maybe 12 hours old. It was the color of a storm cloud. Nolan stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. He said very quietly, "Who?" "I told you, I fell." "Nobody falls and gets a handprint." His voice had dropped to something that was barely a voice at all. It was a register that his employees recognized and his enemies feared, and that Clara, in 2 years of working for him, had never heard directed at her. It sat in the air between them like a frequency just below hearing. "Tell me who touched you." She was shaking, just slightly, a fine tremor in her hands that she was trying very hard to control. It's nothing. I handled it." "You handled it?" He looked at her face, the jaw, the careful posture, the way she was holding her left arm slightly raised, which meant the forearm wasn't the only place that hurt. "What else?" Silence. "Clara." A pause. "I am asking you once more." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the wall had come down. She told him in pieces. They were no longer in the boardroom. Nolan had moved her to his private office at the end of the hall, a room that almost no one except Marek and Clara herself had any reason to enter. He told his assistant at the outer desk to hold everything. He closed the door. He did not sit behind his desk. He sat in the chair across from the low sofa, which was where Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes mostly on the floor, and he let her find the words at her own pace, which cost him more than she could have known. She had arrived at the parking structure at 8:40. Her usual space was on level 2, east side near the stairwell. She'd parked and was walking toward the elevator when two men stepped out from between two parked SUVs. They were wearing the kind of masks that cyclists wear in winter. High-neck gaiters pulled up over the lower half of the face, nondescript, practical, forgettable. One was broad, maybe 6 feet, wearing a dark jacket. The other was shorter and stayed further back, near the stairwell door. The broad one had grabbed her arm before she had time to react. He told her to stop screaming. She hadn't been screaming, she'd been too shocked. And he told her that she worked for Nolan Varick, which she should not have confirmed but did, because her brain was still catching up. And then he said something that Nolan made her repeat twice to make sure he'd heard it correctly. "We know you have the ledger. The encrypted one. Give it to us and you walk away. Make this difficult, and the next thing you carry home is a hospital bill." "What ledger?" Nolan said. Clara looked at him. "The one you gave me to transfer to the secure server 3 weeks ago. The one you said was financial documentation from the offshore restructuring." He was quiet for a moment. "You transferred it." "I transferred it, but the original drive—" She stopped. "It was still in my desk. I hadn't disposed of it yet. I was waiting for confirmation that the transfer completed correctly, and then I forgot. It's been a busy month." "They knew you had it. They knew exactly what it was." Her voice was steady now. She'd moved through the fear into something harder, something more factual. It was one of the things Nolan had noted about her in the first month she worked for him. She processed shock fast and came out the other side analytical. "They didn't ask if I knew what it was. They assumed I did. They used the word encrypted, the exact word." He absorbed this. "What did you say to them?" She lifted her chin, just slightly. It was such a small gesture, but it was the first genuinely direct thing she'd done since she walked into his boardroom. "I said I didn't know what they were talking about. And the big one grabbed my arm." Her voice stayed flat, clinical. "He was very sure I was lying. I think I said something like, I think I told him to let go." A pause. "He didn't. He hit you. He threw me against the car." She touched her jaw briefly, barely, just a touch, checking whether the tenderness was still there. "I hit the side mirror. That's where the face." She lowered her hand. "And then someone came out of the stairwell. Another commuter. They heard the noise, and the big one let go, and they walked away fast toward the exit ramp." She took a breath. "I sat on the ground for a while, and then I came to work." Nolan looked at her for a long moment. "You sat on the ground for a while," he repeated. "I didn't know what else to do." She met his eyes, finally. Held them, steady as anything. "I wasn't going to go to the police. It would raise questions about what I do and who I work for. I wasn't going to call anyone because—" She stopped. "I didn't know who to call." The office was very quiet. Rain on the glass, 42 floors up, reduced to white noise. "Why didn't you call me?" Nolan said. She looked at him like she was waiting to see if he was serious. When it became clear he was, something shifted in her expression. Not hurt exactly, but the look of a person recalibrating their understanding of a relationship they thought they knew the boundaries of. "Because you're my employer," she said carefully. "You're not—" She stopped, started again. "I handle my own problems, Mr. Varick, not when they're my problems wearing your skin." He said it without thinking, and the truth of it hit the room like something physical. He watched her process it, watched the careful, professional distance she kept between them, absorb the sentence and crack slightly under the weight of it. He stood up. "Stay here," he said. "Don't open the door. Don't answer your phone." "What are you going to do?" He was already moving toward the desk, picking up the hard line, and he said it without turning around. "Figure out who inside this building told 2 men in a parking garage that my secretary was carrying a ledger." He heard the slight catch in her breath behind him, because she'd understood it before he said it out loud, possibly before he had. The men hadn't followed her. They hadn't been watching the building, waiting for an opportunity. They had been waiting for her specifically, in the specific parking structure she used, at a time consistent with her morning arrival. Someone who knew Clara's schedule had sent them. Someone who knew the ledger existed, knew its contents, knew where it currently was, and knew that Clara Elowen was the path of least resistance to getting it. Someone who worked for Nolan. He found Marek in his own office on the floor below, working through what looked like a dry logistics report, reading glasses on. Marek, who would die before admitting he needed reading glasses, who never wore them in front of anyone except Nolan and occasionally their mutual attorney. He looked up when Nolan came in without knocking. "Close it," Nolan said. Marek took off the glasses and folded them, looked at Nolan's face for exactly the length of time it took to read whatever was there, and Marek was one of perhaps 3 people on Earth who could read Nolan's face at all. "That's a problem I haven't seen in a while," he said. "Clara was attacked this morning, parking garage." Marek's expression went still. "How bad?" "She'll be fine. They wanted the offshore ledger, the restructuring files from Q3. Nolan sat down across from him, not relaxed, sitting the way he always sat when something was working in him that hadn't resolved yet. They knew she had it. They knew her schedule. They knew the specific parking structure. Could be surveillance. Could be. But the faster answer is an inside source. Marek turned his coffee cup in his hands, once. "Who has access to her schedule?" "Me? You." "The building security log. The 2 scheduling assistants on 41. He paused. "The ledger access log itself, but anyone who knew it existed and processed it through the transfer system." "That's not a long list." "No." "She okay?" Marek asked. It was a quiet question, genuine, as far as Nolan could tell. Marek had always been professional about Clara. Not warm, not unfriendly, the particular neutral courtesy of a man who reserved his actual feelings for a very small number of things and was disciplined about the rest. But he'd never been hostile. "She came to work," Nolan said. "With a handprint bruise and a cracked rib she hasn't mentioned yet." Marek's jaw tightened briefly. "She's stubborn. She didn't want to show weakness." Nolan said it without judgment. He understood it completely. "So what's the move?" Nolan looked at the window, thought about the men in the parking garage, thought about the specific nature of the information they'd had. Not just her schedule, not just the ledger's existence, but its contents. The word encrypted, the offshore connection. That last part was the detail that kept snagging. The ledger's encryption was known to maybe a handful of people. Its offshore connection was known to fewer. The word Nolan kept circling back to was specific. Everything about the attack was specific. Specific meant source. Source meant trust. Trust meant betrayal. He hadn't been betrayed in a very long time. He'd built his network to prevent exactly this. Years of patience, of pruning, of keeping the layers between his public face and his actual operations clean and narrow. He'd been careful. He was always careful. But someone had been more careful. "I'm moving Clara out of the building," he said. "Tonight. She'll stay somewhere secure until I know what we're dealing with." Marek nodded once. "And in the meantime, I need you to run a quiet check on the access logs for the Q3 files. Don't flag it officially. Just pull the raw timestamps and cross-reference." "Against what?" "Against anyone who ran a query on Clara's schedule in the last 2 weeks." He stood. "If there's an intersection, I want to see it." Marek nodded again. No questions, no objections. This was how they'd always worked. The particular fluency of 2 men who'd spent long enough in the same dangerous water to stop needing to explain the currents to each other. Nolan was almost at the door when Marek said, "She matters to you." He stopped. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't quite a question. It was the thing Marek did sometimes. Named the truth of a thing the way a man names a landmark, to make sure they're both looking at the same map. "She's my employee," Nolan said. "That's not what I said." Nolan turned around slowly. Marek was watching him with the particular attention he gave to things that actually interested him. Steady, unblinking, without performance. "I've watched you run this organization for 11 years, he said. "You've never moved a secretary to a secure location." The word secretary sat in the air with a weight it shouldn't have had. There's a leak in the building, Nolan said. I'm not leaving a target in place. That's completely rational, Mark said. That's absolutely the right call. He held Nolan's gaze. I'm just noting that it's also something else. Nolan looked at him for a moment. Run the access logs, Mark. He left. He spent the next 3 hours in motion, 3 floors of the building, 4 conversations that all shared the same controlled subtext of a man taking inventory without telling anyone what he was counting. He pulled the security feed from the parking structure himself, not delegating it, sitting in front of a monitor in the security office with a cup of coffee he didn't drink while he watched the footage from 8:30 to 9. The cameras on level 2, east side, had been offline. Both of them. From 8:22 to 8:51, not malfunctioning, not glitching. Manually switched off through the building's internal security management system, which required an access code that belonged to exactly 6 people, all of them employed by Varick Capital. He sat with that for a moment. Then he wrote down the 6 names, folded the paper, and put it in his jacket pocket. On the way back up to his office, he stopped at the office door and knocked once before entering. Clara was where he'd left her, on the low sofa, but she'd been working. Her tablet was balanced on her knee, and she'd clearly been in his digital files, because the small color-coded system she used to flag urgency items had been applied to his entire pending correspondence stack, which had been chaotic before and was now, in the space of 3 hours, organized with the kind of quiet, comprehensive efficiency that continually unsettled him. She looked up. The bruise on her jaw had deepened in the afternoon light. She'd taken her blazer off, and he could see the full scope of the forearm mark now, broader than he'd registered, running up toward the elbow on one side. I organized your... I see that. He moved to the desk. I'm calling a doctor, someone I use, not a hospital. I'm fine. You have a cracked rib. She went still. I haven't said... You haven't taken a full breath since you sat down, he said, not looking at her, pulling up a number on his personal cell. You're breathing in controlled, shallow increments. You keep your left side toward the wall. You sat down on this sofa by controlling your descent with your right hand on the armrest. He looked at her briefly. I notice things. It's what I do. She looked at him the way she sometimes did, like she was revising something. It's just bruised, she said. Not cracked. I've had cracked before. This is bruised. The doctor will tell us which. Mr. Varick, Nolan. He said it without thinking about it. In this room, for the rest of today, Nolan. Another revision. She absorbed it without comment. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. He put the phone to his ear. I know. The doctor, a compact white-haired woman named Petra Voss, who had been providing discreet medical services to Nolan's organization for going on 7 years, arrived at 6 in the evening and examined Clara in the small conference room adjoining Nolan's office, while Nolan stood outside the closed door with his back against the wall and his arms crossed and didn't check his phone once. When Dr. Voss came out, she said, 2 bruised ribs, not cracked. The arm is soft tissue. No tendon damage. The jaw is bruised. Nothing structural. She looked at Nolan over her glasses. She's going to hurt for a week. She should rest. Will she? No, the doctor said frankly. But you could try telling her. He went in. Clara was sitting on the edge of the examination table, the fold-out kind that Petra brought in her kit, and she'd rolled her sleeve back down and was rebuttoning her cuff with the particular concentration of someone doing something simple to avoid doing something complicated. She looked up when he came in, and whatever she saw in his face made her stop with one button still undone. 2 bruised ribs, he said. I know. You knew before. I suspected. She went back to the button. It's not the first time. He looked at her. The first time I've had bruised ribs. She said it plainly, no invitation for follow-up, and Nolan let it lie because he recognized the tone of a person who had organized their history into rooms they could function around, and who did not want you inside the rooms right now. He knew that tone. He used it himself. I'm moving you tonight, he said. I have a penthouse. It's not connected to anything publicly linked to me. You'll have full security. You can work from there. He paused. I need you to bring the drive. She looked up. The ledger drive. Yes. A beat. Why? Because whoever is inside this building wanted it badly enough to hurt you to get it, he said. And that tells me there's something in it that they don't want me to find, which means I need to find it, and I need it somewhere they can't access it. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face, not quite trust, but the precursor to it, the moment before a person decides. You want me to help you find it, she said. You have a forensic accounting background. He watched her expression shift. She always looked slightly surprised when he demonstrated that he'd paid attention to things she'd never explicitly told him. Your graduate work was in financial forensics. You wrote your thesis on encrypted asset concealment in offshore structures. He held her gaze. The ledger is encrypted. I can break the encryption. You can read what's inside it. Silence. You knew that before you hired me, she said slowly. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He said, I need you with me on this, Clara. Not because you have no choice, because you're the best person for it. The rain was still going outside. The city below was lit and wet and moving 42 floors down, going about its business with no knowledge of the specific, precise catastrophe that was building in this room. Clara looked at her wrist. The bruise had spread into the heel of her hand. She said, I'll get the drive. Me. They left the building at 7:15 through the underground exit that connected to a parking structure 2 blocks north, not the same one, never the same one twice, in a car that wasn't in Nolan's name, driven by a man named Cole, who had been with Nolan since the beginning and whose loyalty was the kind that didn't come with a number attached to it. Nolan sat in the back beside Clara, who sat with her tablet on her knee and her eyes on the city moving past the rain-blurred glass. And she didn't say anything for most of the drive. At a red light on Michigan Avenue, without looking at him, she said, You knew there was someone inside the organization before they attacked me. He considered his answer. I suspected it. 3 months ago. Small things. Gaps where there shouldn't be gaps. A pause. I hadn't pinned it yet. And now? Now I have motivation to move faster. He watched a cab slide past in the opposite lane, trailing a long tail of spray. They made a mistake when they picked you. She turned to look at him. Why? He looked back at her. In the passing light of the city, her face was all shadow and precision, and he thought for the second time today about the particular quality of her. The way she was stubborn and quiet and contained. The way she'd come to work today instead of home. The way she'd said I handled it with a completely straight face while she was shaking. He thought about what it meant that someone had decided she was the soft point in his armor. What it meant that they'd been watching closely enough to identify her. What it meant that they had been right. Because, Nolan said, they assumed you were a liability. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the road. They assumed wrong, she said. It wasn't bravado. It was the flat, factual tone of a woman taking stock of a situation and arriving at a conclusion she intended to act on. And Nolan felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled all day, since the moment she'd walked through that boardroom door. The car moved uptown through the rain. Somewhere behind them, in the Varick Capitol building, a trader was going through motions, eating dinner maybe, or responding to emails, or sitting in a meeting that had nothing to do with any of this, running their hands through their day the same way they always did, with the particular ease of a person who doesn't know they've made a fatal mistake yet. They didn't know that the woman they'd sent 2 men to break in a parking garage was at this moment sitting in a car with Nolan Varick, the ledger drive in her bag, her ribs bruised but her mind already working. They didn't know what she was capable of. By morning, Nolan intended to make sure the trader found out. But first, somewhere between the motion of the car and the city going past, and the particular silence of 2 people who have moved past pretending they are only what they are on paper, something shifted very quietly between them. Clara's hand rested on the seat between them, palm down. Not reaching, just resting. Nolan didn't move his hand toward it, but he didn't move it away. And in the darkened car, with rain on every window and a city full of enemies below, that almost nothing was somehow the most significant thing that had happened all day. The penthouse elevator opened at 11:45 after Dr. Voss had come and gone. After Cole had secured the perimeter, after Clara had eaten something small and mechanical, and then set up her laptop at the kitchen island with the efficiency of someone who did not know how to stop working. Nolan stood at the window of the main room, looking at Chicago from above. The spread of it, the wet glitter, the particular vastness of a city that he had, over the course of his adult life, turned into something that was not quite a kingdom, but was not quite not one, either. He heard her behind him. Keys. A pause. "I'm in," she said. He turned around. She was looking at the laptop screen with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful professional neutrality, not the contained fear from this morning, not the quiet determination from the car. This was something stripped back and concentrated, the face of a person who had just seen something they recognized. "What?" he said. She looked up. Her eyes were dark and very still, and in them was something he identified with a precision born from years of reading rooms and people, and the exact moment when a situation became more serious than previously understood. She said, "Nolan, this ledger isn't offshore restructuring documentation." He waited. "It's a record," she said. "A complete record. Internal payments, names, dates going back 4 years." She turned the laptop to face him. "Someone inside your organization has been running a secondary financial channel, moving money out of your offshore accounts and into a separate network. For 4 years. She paused. "And whoever it is, they knew you were getting close. That's why they wanted this drive." Nolan crossed the room to look at the screen. What he saw there, the names, the amounts, the careful architecture of a theft that had been running in the margins of his empire for years, made something very cold settle in his chest, because the name at the top of the primary transfer authorization, repeated across 146 separate transactions, was one he recognized without difficulty, one he would have recognized anywhere. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. And in the silence of the penthouse above Chicago, with the rain finally beginning to slow, Nolan Varick understood that the man he'd trusted most in the world, the man who had sat in the corner of his boardroom that morning watching with flat, calibrated attention, had been the one who sent 2 strangers to put their hands on the woman standing in front of him. The name on the screen was Marek Vale, not buried, not disguised, not routed through a proxy account designed to create distance, the kind of careful, layered concealment that Nolan would have expected from anyone with Marek's operational experience. It was there in the transfer authorization fields, clean and direct. The same digital signature Marek used on every legitimate document that passed through Varick Capital's internal system. 14 characters. A habit. The particular laziness of a man who had been doing something for so long without consequence that he'd stopped believing consequences were possible. Nolan stood at the kitchen island and read through the first 12 entries without moving. Clara stood 2 feet to his left and said nothing. She had the specific discipline of a woman who understood that the thing happening in front of her required space, and she gave it to him. No prompting, no filling the silence, just the quiet sound of her breathing and the rain outside dropping finally to a low, persistent hiss against the glass. He read for 4 minutes. Then he closed the laptop. He turned away from the counter and walked to the far side of the room, to the windows again, the city again, the spread of lights below in the wet dark. His hands were at his sides. He was very still. Clara watched him from the kitchen island. She didn't approach. 11 years. That was what kept arriving, not as a thought exactly, but as a physical fact, something with weight and dimension. 11 years of a working relationship that had functioned as fluently as anything in Nolan's life ever had. 11 years of a man sitting across from him in rooms like the one they'd been in this morning, reading situations with the particular accurate stillness that Nolan had always respected, because he recognized it as a version of his own. Marek had been the person Nolan called when things went wrong, the person who had stood at the edge of actual violence with him and not flinched, not calculated an exit, not looked at the door. The person who had once, in a city that neither of them named anymore, put himself between Nolan and a gun, not out of obligation, but out of the particular irrational loyalty that Nolan had spent 20 years believing was the one thing in his life that could not be corrupted. 4 years. The transfers went back 4 years, which meant that whatever Marek had decided, whatever calculation had shifted in him, it had happened before any of the events that Nolan might have pointed to as a reason, before the organization restructured, before the new territories, before anything Nolan could identify as a breaking point. It had happened quietly, in the middle of ordinary time, And Mark had kept sitting across from him in rooms, kept reading situations with that accurate stillness, kept being, to all visible purposes, exactly who he'd always been. The cold in Nolan's chest was not anger. Not yet. Anger had heat in it, and this was something below heat, something structural, the particular feeling of a load-bearing wall giving way in silence. "How much?" he said. His back was still to the room. Clara opened the laptop. He heard the keys. 4.3 million, total, across the full 4-year window. A pause. The individual transfers are small, between 18 and 40,000 each, frequent enough to establish a pattern, but sized to stay under the threshold that would trigger an automatic audit flag. He knew the threshold. He set the threshold. Her voice was neutral, precise. According to the administrative access log on the audit system. And it's in here he included it, which is, she stopped briefly. He included the access log in the ledger. I don't know if that was arrogance or documentation, but it's here. Nolan turned around. She was looking at the screen with the same stripped-back concentration as before. Not performing calm, just genuinely operating in a register where the numbers were the thing, where the task of reading them clearly was the available action, and she was taking it. Her left arm was resting on the counter at an angle that avoided pressure on the bruised ribs. Her hair had come half down from its pin. She hadn't fixed it. The laptop light was the only sharp light in the room, and it caught the edge of the bruise on her jaw, the color of old weather. Nolan crossed back to the island, looked at the screen over her shoulder. "Why did he keep the ledger at all?" he said. "Insurance." She didn't hesitate. "If he was ever in a position where you found out, where something broke down, he needed leverage. A record of transactions that implicate him also implicates the accounts they were drawn from. Which are your accounts? Offshore. The kind that aren't supposed to exist." She tilted the screen slightly toward him. "If he surfaces this, you have problems that go a long way beyond a personnel issue." He was building a mutual destruction guarantee, or he always intended to use it offensively. She looked at him. Someone who has been this deliberate for 4 years doesn't think in purely defensive terms. Nolan was quiet. "The men in the parking garage," she said. "They knew exactly what the drive was. They knew the word encrypted. They knew it was connected to offshore accounts." She turned on the stool to face him more directly. "That's not information from a document. That's information from a briefing. Someone sat those 2 men down and told them specifically what they were looking for and why it mattered. Mark briefed them, or someone he hired to run the operation did, but the knowledge originated with him." She held his gaze. "He sent them because he knew the transfer had completed and the original drive was still in my desk. He'd been waiting for an opportunity to get it before you thought to retrieve it yourself." "How do you know he was waiting?" "Because the transfer completed 22 days ago." She turned the screen again, pointed to a timestamp. "He had 22 days to do this quietly. He didn't. He waited until this morning, which means something changed. Something made him move faster than he intended to." Nolan looked at the timestamp, thought about the past 22 days, ran through the operational calendar, the Faro meeting, the Port Authority review, a conversation last week in which he'd mentioned quietly to Mark that the offshore restructuring audit was going to begin next month. There it was. "I told him about the audit," Nolan said. Clara nodded slowly. "He panicked. Not visibly. Not in any way you would have seen. But internally, he recalculated the window. He needed the drive before the audit began, because the audit would surface the same records I just read." She paused. "He had to move. And he picked you because I was the obvious path. I processed the original transfer. I had the drive. I'm not—" She stopped. Something moved across her face that she smoothed back into flatness almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. "I'm not the person you'd expect to be a problem." The way she said it, the particular compression in the word expect, landed in the room with a weight she hadn't intended. He looked at her. She looked at the screen. "He was wrong about that," Nolan said. She didn't respond, but her jaw moved once, the tight small movement of a person absorbing a thing they're not ready to answer. He straightened up. "I need to make a call." "To who?" "Cole." He moved toward the other side of the room, pulling out his cell. "And then I need to sit with what the next move looks like. You're not going to confront him tonight. It wasn't a question. He glanced back at her. No. Good. She turned back to the laptop. Because if you confront him without controlling every variable, he surfaces the ledger and you spend the next 2 years managing the fallout from the offshore accounts instead of dealing with him. A pause. You need to make the ledger useless to him before you move. He stopped. She was looking at the screen, not at him. How? He said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You give him a version that doesn't exist yet. A fake. You build an encryption key that looks real, looks like the legitimate key to the real ledger, and you feed it to him through a channel he trusts. When he tries to use it, it surfaces nothing, or it surfaces something you've planted. She turned to look at him. But more usefully, the moment he tries to access it, you'll know exactly which channel he used, which means you'll know who helped him. Mol bishkote. Nolan held her gaze for a long moment. You've done this before, he said. I've studied it. A pause that had something in it. Not quite a correction, not quite a confession. My graduate thesis involved 3 case studies of forensic traps built into financial systems to expose internal fraud. The methodology is well documented. How long would it take you to build the fake key? If I have the right tools and access to the original encryption architecture, she glanced at the laptop back at him. 12 hours. Maybe 10. He looked at her, the bruised jaw, the arm, the careful way she was breathing. He thought about what Dr. Voss had said. She should rest. You're not working through the night, he said. You need the trap built before he realizes the garage operation failed. Her voice was entirely flat. Not arguing exactly, just presenting a fact and its implications. If 2 men go back to whoever sent them and say the target didn't give up the drive, he's going to know the approach failed. He's going to move to something else. She held his gaze without flinching. How long before he does that? Nolan thought about Marek, the particular machinery of his patience, the way he'd always operated, methodical, unhurried, with the long game thinking of a man who'd learned that most problems solved themselves if you waited long enough and kept your variables controlled. He won't move immediately, Nolan said. He'll assume I don't know the drive is gone. He'll watch for 24 hours minimum, maybe 48. Then I have time to sleep. She closed the laptop. 4 hours. I'll start at 3. He started to say something and stopped. She looked at him with the particular expression she got when she thought he was about to say something that would require her to disagree with him. I've worked on less, she said, and this matters more than anything I've worked on. A pause. I want to find out who did this to me. I'm capable of doing it. Let me. The room was quiet. The east bedroom, he said finally. There are clothes in the closet. Things people have left. Find something that fits. He moved toward the hallway. I'll be up. She slid off the stool. He was halfway to the door when she said, Nolan. He stopped. Thank you. She said it simply. No performance, no careful professional qualification. For today, for not... She stopped. Started again. For not making me handle it alone. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about saying several things. He said, Get some sleep. He didn't sleep. He sat in the main room with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and the real ledger open on his own laptop. Not reading, exactly, but moving through it the way he moved through any problem, which was to walk the perimeter first and understand the shape before approaching the center. He made 2 calls. The first to Cole, brief and operational, establishing a secondary security configuration around the penthouse building that would not show up on the Varick Capital system. The second call was longer, to an attorney who operated in the specific gray zone between legitimate counsel and operational necessity, a woman named Hartley who had been managing Nolan's legal exposure for 8 years and who received calls at midnight with the particular equanimity of someone who had long since made peace with the hours her income required. He told her about the ledger. Not the full picture, not Marek's name, not yet, but the structure of it, the nature of the exposure, the offshore accounts. He needed to know what a surface of this information would do if it hit the wrong environment. Hartley told him. It was, as he'd expected, significant. Not catastrophic. He'd spent years ensuring that the architecture of his legitimate and illegitimate operations were separated by enough layers and legal insulation that a direct attack on one wouldn't automatically destroy the other. But significant. A sustained legal offensive using the ledger as a primary exhibit would cost him 18 months minimum, 3 law firms, and approximately half of the political relationships he'd spent a decade building. Mark knew all of this, had been present for the construction of most of it. Nolan ended the call and sat in the dark of the penthouse and thought about the specific texture of being betrayed by the person who knew you best. Not the anger of it. The anger was there, controlled and cold and completely available, waiting in the way that useful things wait. But underneath the anger was something he hadn't felt in a very long time, something he would not have named aloud in any company. He had trusted Mark in the way that men who do not trust easily trust when they finally do. Completely, structurally, the way you trust a load-bearing wall. You don't check it every day. You build around it. You build on top of it. You extend the whole architecture of what you're constructing outward from the assumption that the wall holds. 11 years. He heard movement behind him at 2:20, turned. Clara was in the doorway of the hallway in a gray shirt that was 2 sizes too large in her own slacks from earlier. She'd found the top, but apparently not the bottoms. With her hair loose, which he had not seen before, which was longer than the pinned version suggested, and which she pushed back from her face with one hand as she looked at him across the dark room. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." She came into the room and sat on the other end of the sofa, pulling her feet up. She looked at the laptop. "How far did you get?" "Far enough." He looked at her. "You're up early." "I slept 3.5 hours. I'm wired." She held out her hand. "Give me the laptop." "Your ribs are bruised, not broken. I can type." She held his gaze steadily. "Give me the laptop, Nolan." He looked at her for a moment. Then he passed it across. She opened it, pulled up a new window, and began typing with the focused velocity of someone who had been running the problem in the background through her sleep and was now executing an approach she'd already fully designed. He watched her hands on the keys, quick, certain, no backspacing, and felt something he didn't have an exact name for. Utility wasn't right. Partnership wasn't quite right either. Something between those. Something without a clean word. He got up and made coffee. By 5:30 in the morning, the trap existed. It was elegant in the way that truly functional things are elegant. Not decorated, just precisely right. A fake encryption key built on the same architecture as the real one, believable to anyone who knew what they were looking at, designed to respond to access attempts with a surface layer of convincing data before logging the attempt and collapsing. If Marek, or anyone Marek sent, tried to use it to access the ledger, the key would appear to work for approximately 90 seconds, long enough for the user to believe they had what they needed. Then it would brick, and the access log would capture the device, the IP routing, and the specific user credential used to initiate the attempt. Clara walked Nolan through it at the kitchen island over cold coffee, and he listened with the complete attention he gave to things that actually mattered, asking 4 questions. Precise, operational, the kind of questions that demonstrated he'd understood the mechanism and was testing its edges. She answered all 4 without hesitation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The channel. You said I need to feed it to him through a channel he trusts." "Yes." She turned his laptop. "The most efficient delivery is through someone Marek believes he controls. A secondary source, someone in the organization who has been feeding him information without knowing the full picture. A tool." She paused. "Do you have a candidate?" He thought. "The commissioner, Pharaoh." She blinked. "From yesterday's meeting. He gave me a name. The intermediary who made first contact. The board attorney." He looked at her. If Marek used an intermediary to approach Pharaoh, that intermediary is the channel. If I feed the fake key through Pharaoh, make it look like Pharaoh recovered it independently from a source inside my organization, Marek receives it through a chain he set up himself. He'll believe it. Clara was quiet for a moment, working through it. "That's clean," she said. "That's very clean." Another pause. "It requires Pharaoh's cooperation." "Pharaoh signed a document yesterday that guarantees his cooperation for the foreseeable future." She looked at him. "You anticipated this." "I anticipated having a use for him." He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "I didn't anticipate this specific use, But Pharaoh is the kind of variable you keep. She was looking at him the way she sometimes looked at him. The assessing, slightly unsettled look of someone who keeps revising their model of a person and finding the revisions consistently in the same direction. Not alarmed. Something more complicated. "You've been thinking about this for a long time," she said. Not accusingly. Not Marek specifically, but this. The shape of this situation. "Betrayal has a shape," he said. "I've seen enough of it to know the edges." "Who else?" He looked at her. "You said before, when you told me about the suspected inside source, you said 3 months ago, small things. You weren't only watching Marek 3 months ago, you were watching everyone." He said it without apology. "I watch everyone." She absorbed this. "Including me," she said. He held her gaze. "Including you." Something crossed her face. Not hurt. She'd expected this answer, or some version of it. He could see that in the way it landed without shock. But it sat with her for a moment, the explicit confirmation, and he watched her work through it with the same honest self-inventory she brought to the ledger, to the encryption key, to all of it. "What did you find?" she said. "That you're exactly what you appear to be." He paused. "Which is rarer than it sounds." She looked at him for a long moment across the island. The city outside the windows was beginning to lighten. Gray first, then a dirty pink that came through the low cloud cover over the lake. The particular grudging dawn of a city that doesn't do anything gently. They'd been awake through the whole night. He could see it in her. The fine lines around her eyes, the controlled, shallow breathing, the slight pallor that came from hours of focus and pain management running simultaneously. He could feel it in himself. Not exhaustion exactly, a sharpened, extended wakefulness that had the quality of running past where the body wanted to stop. "The trap is ready," she said. "What's the next step?" "I contact Pharaoh this morning. Set the channel." He looked at the laptop, the ledger behind it, the architecture of a 4-year theft sitting in files on a hard drive in a penthouse 40 stories above a city that didn't know any of this was happening. "And then I wait for Marek to do what Marek does. Which is move on information the moment he receives it." He stood up from the stool. He's never been good at waiting when a door is open. It's the only impatience he has, but it's consistent. He looked at her. "I've watched it for 11 years. She stood too, more carefully, hand on the counter, the ribs making themselves known in the way of things that are not going to let you pretend they're not there. She straightened, didn't acknowledge it. "And if he doesn't use the channel," she said, "if he goes around Pharaoh, then we adjust." "We," she said, just the word, flat, like she was testing its weight. "You're in this," Nolan said. "You were in it before I put you in the car last night. They made you in it when they put their hands on you." His voice was even. "That means you stay close, you stay informed, and you tell me immediately if anything changes that I need to know about." A pause. "And it means I don't leave you unprotected, not while this is unresolved." She looked at him for a moment with the complicated expression that kept visiting her face in his presence. The expression of a woman who has organized her entire life around being self-sufficient and who is finding, at 31, that she's not sure whether the hand being extended to her is one she wants to take or one she's afraid to. "All right," she said. It was a small word, but the way she said it, without hedge, without the professional qualification she usually wrapped around everything, made it larger. He nodded, picked up his phone, moved toward the window. Outside, the city was coming into its gray Tuesday morning, wet and ordinary and entirely unaware. Somewhere in it, in an apartment or an office or a car, Mark Vale was waking up, was going through the motions of a morning that still looked like every other morning, had not yet received the notification that the operation in the parking garage had ultimately yielded nothing, had not yet understood that the drive he needed was no longer where it had been, was not yet aware that the woman he'd written off as a soft target had spent the night building the instrument of his exposure. Nolan pulled up Pharaoh's number, pressed call. It rang twice. Then Pharaoh's voice, thick with the sleep of a man who'd spent the previous evening marinating in the particular misery of having signed a document that changed his life, rough and wary and already afraid. "It's Varric," Nolan said. "I need you in an office. I'm going to text you in the next 10 minutes. This morning, 8 o'clock. He paused. "And Pharaoh, the intermediary you used, The board attorney. I need his number. A silence on the line. The sound of Pharaoh recalibrating. You're using me, Pharaoh said. Not protesting, just identifying it. Yes, Nolan said. So, be on time. He ended the call and looked at the city. Behind him, he heard Clara set her coffee cup in the sink, heard the particular careful silence of someone standing still and thinking hard about something they haven't said yet. Nolan. He turned. She was standing by the counter, arms crossed, not defensively, just the instinctive self-containment of a person who runs cold and in pain. Her expression had changed. The analytical focus from the laptop work had shifted into something quieter, more direct. Mark was in the room when I came in yesterday, she said. He saw my arm. Nolan was very still. He looked at it, she said. She stopped. When you made me roll my sleeve up, he was still in the room. He looked at the bruise, and then he looked at you. A pause. And his face didn't change. The cold thing in Nolan's chest turned over once. She was right. He'd replayed the scene in the boardroom several times through the night, running the footage of his own memory the way he'd run the parking garage feed, looking for gaps. He'd clocked Marek's expression as the room went quiet. He'd read it as controlled response, the professional stillness of a man who'd learned long ago to keep his reactions on a very short leash in front of an audience. He had not read it as the stillness of a man looking at the result of his own order and feeling nothing about it. He knew exactly what that bruise was, Clara said quietly. He sent them. He watched you look at what he'd done, and he said, she paused. He asked if I was okay. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Nolan had nothing to say to that. Clara looked at him steadily. Her jaw was tight. Not with fear, with the specific compression of a person who has just arrived, fully, at the understanding of how close the danger had actually been, and who is now standing on the correct side of it but has not quite stopped shaking from the crossing. Build the trap, she said. Build the trap, she said. Make it perfect. He already intended to. Pharaoh arrived at 8:03, not the Varick Capitol building. Nolan had used a different address, a property management office on the 14th floor of a building on Wacker that existed on paper as a real estate consulting firm, and in practice as one of 6 locations Nolan maintained for conversations that did not belong in any of his official spaces. The office was clean, minimal, 2 chairs and a table and a window that looked at the side of another building. Nolan was already there when Pharaoh came through the door, and Cole was in the hallway outside, and Clara was not present, which was a decision Nolan had made without explaining it, and which he held to. Pharaoh looked worse than he had the day before. He'd slept in the anxiety of a man who'd signed something irrevocable and spent the hours after signing running the implications. His color was bad. He was wearing a different suit but the same expression, the particular tight-eyed watchfulness of someone who has run out of exits and is now trying to figure out how to be useful enough to matter. Nolan sat down across from him and said, without preamble, the intermediary, the board attorney. His name. Casson, Pharaoh said. Philip Casson. He's on the Port Authority Oversight Board. He's been there 6 years. I don't know who he reports to. He came to me directly. Described the approach. Lunch. He said it was about the board's infrastructure review. Then about 40 minutes in, he said he had a client. He didn't use a name, said it was a private client who needed certain shipments to clear without the standard flagging protocol. He said the arrangement was financially generous and that there was no risk because the client had visibility into the inspection schedule. Pharaoh's hands were flat on the table. He was holding them there deliberately. I asked how. He said the client had someone on the inside of the inspection system. A pause. I assumed that meant port staff. I didn't ask. It meant someone inside my organization, Nolan said. Pharaoh absorbed this. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. Nolan looked at him steadily. That's why you're sitting here instead of somewhere less comfortable. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the table. You're going to contact Casson today, this morning, before noon. You're going to tell him that the operation from yesterday, he'll know what you mean, didn't go as expected, but that you've recovered something through an independent source, a drive, encrypted. You're going to say you can pass it to him by end of day. Wan man mam tichimosinin. Pharaoh looked at the paper. And the drive. You'll be given a drive. It will look exactly like what they're expecting. Nolan held his gaze. You will not open it. You will not copy it. You will pass it to Casson the way I tell you to, through the channel I specify, and you will report back to me the moment he confirms receipt. And then you've done your part and you go back to your life. Pharaoh was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not reluctance, but the specific discomfort of a man doing the math on whether the thing he's being asked to do puts him in the middle of something violent. What happens to Casson? He said. Nothing that involves you. It wasn't reassurance exactly, but Pharaoh, who was a practical man at his core, took it as sufficient. He reached for the paper, read it, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket. The number's on the back, Nolan said. Pharaoh nodded, stood, looked at Nolan once more. A look that had in it the specific quality of a man looking at a situation he will be processing for a long time afterward, a situation he will construct a careful personal narrative around in order to live with his own role in it. Then he left. Nolan sat in the empty office for 2 minutes. Then he called Clara. It's in motion, he said. How long until the drive is ready? It's ready, she said. I finished it an hour ago. I've been checking the verification parameters. I'll send Cole. I know. A pause. Nolan, the verification parameters. I built in a secondary trigger. If the key is accessed from a device that's already been registered inside the Varick Capital network, it flags the device ID separately, before the 90-second window. He was quiet. You think he'll access it from inside the building. I think Mark doesn't believe he's been identified, which means he has no reason to use a clean device. Another pause. If I'm right, we'll know within seconds of the attempt. Not 90 seconds, seconds. He thought about Marek in his office on the 39th floor, sitting with his reading glasses and his logistics reports, and his paper coffee cup, going about the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday, the particular performance of normalcy, the long, patient discipline of a man who had been performing for 11 years. You're right, Nolan said. He ended the call and went to find Cole. Dead. The drive reached Pharaoh at 10:15. Pharaoh contacted Casson at 10:42. Nolan knew this because Pharaoh sent a 3-word text to the number on the back of the paper. Message sent, confirmed. And because the secondary monitoring that Cole had placed on Pharaoh's personal phone the previous afternoon registered the outgoing call at 10:42 and 11 seconds, duration 4 minutes and 8 seconds, to a number registered to Philip Casson, board attorney, Chicago Port Authority oversight. Nolan spent the hours between 10:45 and 2 in the afternoon in the Varick Capitol building in his own office, doing the work of the legitimate empire. The calls, the reviews, the correspondence that Clara had organized the night before, with the specific controlled functionality of a man who has learned to partition his mind completely, to run one layer of himself at full operational capacity while another layer sits absolutely still and waits. At 11, Marek knocked on his open office door. You look terrible, Marek said by way of greeting. He came in and sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited, which he'd always done, which had always been one of the markers of the particular shorthand between them. He was in a dark suit, clean, unhurried. His reading glasses were in his breast pocket. He had a takeout coffee from the place on the ground floor that he used every morning without exception. Bad night, Nolan said. Clara okay? The name landed cleanly. No hesitation, no performance around it. Just the name, dropped into the conversation with the particular casual weight of a genuine inquiry. Nolan looked at his screen and said, She's fine. I set her up somewhere secure until I figure out who's running the leak. Smart. Marek drank his coffee. You pulling the access logs? Already done. Running a cross-reference. Find anything? Not yet. Marek nodded. He sat for a moment with the comfortable silence of a man in a room he knew well, in a relationship he believed was intact, with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who had received word this morning, Nolan was certain of this, that a drive was in transit, that the operation had recovered, that the thing he'd been waiting for was almost in his hands. The Pharaoh meeting went clean? Marek asked. Clean enough. He'll cooperate. Good. Another drink. You want me to run point on the access log cross-reference? Take it off your plate. I've got it, Nolan said. But thank you. Marek looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. The kind of look that two people who know each other very well exchange without either of them marking it consciously. A look that is half assessment and half habit. You're quiet, Marek said. I'm tired. Yeah. Marek stood. Get some food. You don't eat when you're running a problem. He moved toward the door. I'll check in at 4. He left. Nolan sat in his office and looked at the door for a long time after it closed. The trigger fired at 2:17 in the afternoon. Nolan was on the phone with the Hartley when his secondary cell, the one running the monitoring protocol Clara had configured, vibrated on the desk. He looked at the screen, ended the call without explanation, picked up the secondary cell. The flag read, Access attempt logged, device ID, MV-internal-07, location, Varick, Capitol Building, floor 39, time 14:17, 03, credential, m.vale.admin. He set the phone down. Floor 39, Marek's office, his own administrative credential. He hadn't even bothered with a clean device. He'd used his work terminal, the same machine he used every day, registered on the internal network under his own name. Either he was that confident he hadn't been identified, or he was moving so fast that caution had become a secondary concern. Nolan thought about what Clara had said at 5 in the morning. Something made him move faster than he intended to. He picked up the phone and called her. She picked up on the first ring. It triggered, she said. She'd been watching the same feed. Floor 39, his own credential. A beat of silence. He's already in the 90-second window. He'll hit the collapse in a pause. Now, it's bricked. Nolan stood up from his desk. He knows, Clara said. Her voice had changed. Not louder, but tighter. The moment the key collapses, he'll know it was a fake. He'll know someone built it specifically for him. He'll know I have the real ledger, Nolan said, and that I've been watching him since at least this morning. What does he do? Nolan was already moving to the window. He looked down at the city, then up. Reflex. Toward the notional location of the 39th floor above him. He makes a decision, fast. He's not built for retreating. He never has been. He moved back toward the desk. He'll escalate. He'll go to whatever the next option is. What's the next option? Surfacing the offshore account data. Nolan picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. Sending it somewhere that guarantees a response before I can contain it. Federal level, if he moves fast, or to someone in the city who has enough leverage with the right offices to make it hurt. He paused. He has the account information memorized. He doesn't need the drive to do that. He just needs a channel and 20 minutes. Then you need to move now. I know. He was already at the door. Stay in the penthouse. Lock the secondary deadbolt, the one on the upper track. Don't open it for anyone except Cole, and don't call me unless it's critical because I'm going to be... Nolan. Her voice was sharp. Don't go to his office alone. He stopped with his hand on the door. He sent 2 men to a parking garage with instructions to break me if I didn't cooperate, she said. Her voice was very steady. He sat in a room and watched you look at my arm. Don't walk into his office alone. The sentence landed in him somewhere structural. Cole is in the building, he said. Take Cole. A beat. All right, he said. He went. Cole was on the 41st floor in the security monitoring room, a small space behind the reception desk that contained the building's internal camera feeds and access logs, which was where Nolan had stationed him since morning. He found him in 30 seconds and said 4 words. 39. Now. Quiet. Cole put down his coffee and came. They took the stairs. Not the elevator. Elevators announced arrival, and Nolan wanted the approach clean. The 39th floor was Varick Capital's operational management level, Marek's domain, the floor where the underboss of the organization ran the logistics of both the legitimate and the other empire simultaneously, with a staff of 6 people who occupied a long open-plan office adjacent to Marek's private office at the far end. At 2:20 on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 of those staff were at their desks. 1 was away from hers. 2 were in a glass-walled conference room with the door closed. Normal. Entirely normal. Nolan walked the length of the open-plan floor without stopping and knocked once on Merrick's office door. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Cole looked at him. Nolan looked at the lock. Standard internal, the same configuration on every private office in the building. Cole reached into his jacket and produced a thin tool that resolved the question of the lock in approximately 8 seconds. The door swung open. Marek's office was empty. Not vacated. The reading glasses were on the desk, beside the paper coffee cup. The logistics report he'd been reviewing that morning was still open, midway through a page, a pen laid across it at the angle of something set down in a hurry. The computer monitor was on, locked now, the screen showing only the Varick Capital screensaver, which was what it would show after the session had been terminated. The desk lamp was on. The jacket Marek had been wearing this morning was across the back of his chair. He'd left without his jacket. Nolan stood in the doorway and looked at the room and understood, with the cold precision of a man whose instincts had survived 20 years of exactly this, what the jacket on the chair meant. A man who leaves his jacket behind is a man who left fast and did not intend to return to retrieve it. A man who leaves his jacket behind has made a decision in the last 5 minutes about where he's going that does not include coming back to this office. Building cameras, Nolan said. Cole was already on his phone. A pause. He came off the 39th floor at 1419, took the elevator to the lobby, walked out the Michigan Avenue exit. Another pause. He's gone. Nolan moved into the office, looked at the desk, looked at the computer, looked at the pen laid across the report, and the specific angle of it, and the page it was on. A logistics summary for a freight terminal in Gary, Indiana. He'd been reviewing shipping documentation when the key collapsed, when he understood that Nolan had seen him, when he ran. Nolan picked up the pen, set it back down. He could feel Cole at the door, not speaking, understanding that the silence was operating. Marek had run, which meant he wasn't going to the federal channels. Not immediately. A man going to the federal channels doesn't run from his own building. He walks out calmly and makes a call. Running meant something else. Running meant someone to go to, somewhere to regroup, a contingency that had been prepared and that was now being activated. Which meant Marek had anticipated this possibility. Which meant the trap had not been a surprise to him. Not entirely. Nolan stood very still in the center of his oldest ally's empty office and ran the timeline backward. The key had collapsed at 2:17. Marek had been off the 39th floor by 2:19, 90 seconds after the collapse. Not enough time to process the failure, weigh the options, make a decision, and leave. Not for a man running the arithmetic cold, unless he'd already decided, unless the key collapse was not the trigger, unless Marek had been waiting for a confirmation that things had gone wrong, and the collapse was that confirmation. And the decision was already made, and the destination was already chosen, and the 2 minutes had been nothing more than the time it took to close a laptop and put down a pen. Nolan pulled out his phone and called Clara. She picked up immediately. He ran, Nolan said. A silence. Then, he was already planning to. Yes, which means he had a contingency prepared. Her voice was very controlled. Nolan had learned to read her voice the same way he read faces. The particular texture of her control, where it held and where it cost her. Right now, it was costing her. Nolan, if he prepared a contingency, he may have prepared more than one. I know. He knows about the penthouse. A pause. The particular quality of the pause changed something in his chest. You told him you'd moved me to a secure location. You didn't say where, but he... She stopped. He's been inside your organizational structure for 11 years. He knows the properties. He knows the... Cole. Nolan was already moving toward the door. Get to the penthouse, now. Don't call me, just go. Cole was gone before Nolan finished the sentence. Clara, he said into the phone. His voice had dropped to its lowest register. Not performance, not pressure tactic. Just the voice of a man who has realized in the last 30 seconds that the thing he's been afraid of losing is in a room he's not in. Are the deadbolts engaged? I'm doing it now. The sound of movement, quick, controlled, the clunk of a heavy lock. Upper track, done. Don't open the door. I won't. A beat. I need you to tell me what he looks like when he's not in control. What? If he comes to that door, I need to know what he sounds like. What he'll say to get me to open it. Her voice was steady as anything. I've only ever seen him controlled. What does he sound like when he isn't? Nolan was in the stairwell, moving up. Instinct, not logic. The stairs faster than the elevator when your hands need to be doing something. He thought about Marek without control. He had seen it twice in 11 years. Both times in the first year, before Marek had fully constructed the wall, before the discipline had become the reflex. He tried to call up the specific texture of it. He gets very quiet, Nolan said. Quieter than usual. He stops moving. His hands go very still. He pushed through a door. He asks simple questions, not arguments, questions, single sentences. He's trying to locate the exact shape of the problem. A pause. If he sounds reasonable, that's when he's most dangerous. Understood, Clara said. She didn't say anything else. He kept moving. Cole reached the penthouse building at 2:41. Nolan knew this because Cole sent a single text, on site, as Nolan was in the car heading uptown through the particular misery of Tuesday afternoon traffic, a city that did not care about the specific emergency running through its middle. He pushed the car through 2 yellows and 1 red light that he caught the tail of, and the driver, not Cole, a secondary man named Reyes, said nothing and drove. The phone rang at 2:44. Not Cole, not Clara. Marek. Nolan looked at the screen for 1 full second, then he answered. Where are you? Nolan said. Does it matter? Marek's voice was exactly as Nolan had described it to Clara. Quiet. Quieter than usual. The particular quietness of a man who has moved past the point of pretending. It matters to me. I imagine it does. A pause. Not long, just enough. I'm not coming back to the building. You know that. I know. And you have the ledger, the real one. You've had it since last night. Another pause. She built the trap, the girl. The way he said it, the girl, had nothing in it. No heat, no contempt, just a category label, a variable, and a problem. That flatness was, Nolan thought, the most honest thing Marek had said in 4 years. It was how he actually thought about her, about most people. Her name is Clara, Nolan said. Silence. She's better than I gave her credit for, Marek said. I won't make that mistake again. The sentence landed in the car like a temperature drop. You won't get near her again, Nolan said. Quiet. Absolute. You're confident about that? Yes. A sound on the line that might have been a laugh. Brief, without humor. The exhalation of a man who finds something technically amusing in the way that problems sometimes are. You moved her because she matters to you. I knew it before you did, probably. I've been watching you not know it for 8, 9 months. A pause. She's the first thing in a long time that's made you human. And that bothered you. It made you soft, Marek said. Not the way people usually go soft. You didn't stop being functional. You got careful. You started making decisions with an extra variable. The Hendricks deal 6 months ago. You had a clean move, and you didn't take it because it would have required pulling staff from the building for 3 days, and you didn't want her alone in there. I saw it. I didn't say anything. Another pause. But I cataloged it. Nolan was looking at the street ahead. The car was moving. You've been building the exit for 4 years, Marek. Before she was in the picture. The exit, yes. I built it because I could. Because you trusted me completely, and completely is a resource I intended to use. His voice stayed level. But the timeline changed because of her. I moved early because of her. And that was... He stopped. That was an error. Sentimentality, Nolan said. You moved early because you were angry. A beat. Maybe, Marek said. You sent those men because you were angry, not because it was operationally smart. You know it wasn't. You sent them because you wanted to show me what it looked like. You wanted me to walk into that boardroom and see it. Nolan's voice was absolutely even. You wanted me to feel it. The silence that followed was different from the others. Longer. The particular silence of a man who has been accurately read and doesn't know whether to confirm it or deny it, and chooses, finally, neither. I have copies of the offshore documentation, Marek said. Everything in the ledger and more. Accounts, structures, transaction histories going back further than the ledger covers. I built the documentation set over 3 years, progressively. Every time you trusted me with something new, I documented it. A pause. If I surface that to the right people in the next 6 hours, you spend the next decade in a courtroom. Your legitimate empire, the capital management, the property portfolio, all of it becomes evidence in a federal asset seizure proceeding. Nolan said nothing. I'm not asking for the throne, Mark said. I'm past that. I'm asking for an exit. Clean, complete. The 4.3 stays. I leave Chicago, I leave the country if that's what it takes, and you never hear from me again. His voice was very still. If you come after me, the documentation surfaces. If I disappear from anywhere unexpected, it surfaces automatically. I've arranged for that. The car stopped at a light. Nolan looked at the street. An ordinary Tuesday. A woman walking a dog. A courier on a bicycle. A world entirely absent of the specific crisis occurring inside this vehicle. You're asking me to let you walk, Nolan said. I'm telling you the terms under which we both survive this, Mark said. Nolan thought about Clara's voice on the phone. Build the trap. Make it perfect. He thought about her hand on the counter in the pre-dawn kitchen, the city going gray outside. 11 years of Mark Vale sitting across from him in rooms and reading situations with absolute accuracy and using that accuracy like a scalpel for 4 years, in the dark. He thought about the jacket on the chair, the pen on the report, the 2 minutes between the key collapsing and Mark walking out of the building. And he thought about the one thing Mark had said, the thing that had slid past in the context of the rest of it, but was now sitting in the foreground of Nolan's attention with a weight that grew the more he looked at. The one thing Mark had said. I've arranged for that. Nolan turned it over in the back of his mind the way a man turns over a stone he already knows has something under it. If the documentation surfaced automatically upon Mark's unexpected disappearance, and if Mark had truly spent 3 years building the package, then the arrangement required a third party. Someone holding the trigger. Someone Mark trusted enough to give it to, and trusted enough not to pull it prematurely, and trusted enough to know the difference between an unexpected disappearance and a negotiated exit. Mark trusted almost no one. The list of people who qualified was very short, and the only name on that list that Nolan didn't already have a location for was Philip Casson, the board attorney, the intermediary, the man who had approached Pharaoh 14 months ago with a client who needed shipments to move clean, the man who had received the fake drive this afternoon through Pharaoh's channel and who had, by now, attempted to use it and found it bricked and understood that something had gone wrong. Casson wasn't just the channel. He was the failsafe. Where is Casson? Nolan said. Silence on the line. Just a half second of it. Barely anything. A fraction. But Mark was a man who did not hesitate, and the half second was its own answer. We're done talking, Mark said. He ended the call. Nolan looked at Reyes in the front seat. Change of destination, he said. I need an address. What? It took 11 minutes to get Casson's location. Not from any official source, from a property record cross-referenced against a vehicle registration that Nolan's document man pulled off a secured system in the time it took Reyes to drive 4 blocks and pull over while Nolan worked his phone. Casson owned a property in Lincoln Park, a townhouse on a residential street, 3 stories, owned through a holding company that had been incorporated in Delaware 8 years ago. The kind of property structure that a man builds when he wants distance between his name and his address, which told Nolan something about how long Casson had been operating in spaces where that kind of distance mattered. He called Cole. Still at the penthouse, Cole said. Nothing on approach. The building is clean. Stay there. Nolan looked at the street through the window. She doesn't move. Nobody comes in. Understood. He called Clara next. She answered before the first ring finished. I'm fine, she said before he could ask. Cole's here. The building is locked. A pause. You found something. Casson is the failsafe. Mark has him holding the documentation package. A beat. You're going to him. Yes. Nolan. Her voice was very steady. The steadiness that cost her, the kind he'd learned to read. Mark knows you'll make that connection. He's had 11 years to know how you think. I know. Which means he may be going there too. I know, Clara. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The silence of two people who have run out of preparation and are standing at the edge of the part that can't be planned. Come back, she said. Simple. Not decorated. He looked at the window. The city moving past. Reyes, he said. Lincoln Park. Poet. The townhouse on Burling Street was the kind of building that existed to look unremarkable. Brown brick, black iron fence, window boxes with something green and maintained in them. A front door painted a dark green that matched everything else on the block. The street was quiet at 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. School pickups hadn't started yet. Most residents at work. Reyes parked on the next block. Nolan got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the street the way he always looked at spaces, reading exits, reading angles, reading the particular texture of stillness that told him whether something was already in motion or whether he had arrived first. The street was still. He walked. The front gate was unlocked. He noted it, walked the short path to the front door and rang the bell. Not hesitating, not approaching from the side, just the direct front door approach of a man who wanted whoever was inside to open the door before deciding anything else about the situation. He heard movement inside, the specific sound of someone crossing a hardwood floor quickly, which was not the sound of someone expecting a casual visitor. The door opened on a chain. Philip Casson was 60, gray-haired, with the sharp, compressed features of a man who had spent his career in rooms where language was a weapon, and had learned to make his face as unreadable as possible. He had a phone in his hand. He looked at Nolan through the chain gap, and something moved in his face. Not surprise, which confirmed what Nolan already suspected. He'd been waiting for something to arrive. He just hadn't been certain what shape it would take. Mr. Varick, Casson said, open the door. I don't think... Philip? Nolan looked at him through the gap with the specific quality of attention that he reserved for moments when the performance of patience was the only thing standing between a conversation and something faster. Open the door, or I make a call that has 6 people on your front steps in 9 minutes. Your choice is whether this happens quietly or loudly. The chain came off. Nolan stepped inside. The entry hall was narrow, well-furnished, the walls lined with bookshelves that had the particular density of someone who actually read. Not decorator's shelves, actual books, cracked spines, and mismatched heights. A lawyer's house, the kind of space that was organized around the management of information and the appearance of legitimate consequence. Casson was in a gray sweater and dark slacks, not office clothes, which meant he'd come home to manage whatever the collapse of the fake drive had set in motion. He held his phone with both hands now, slightly raised, not quite threatening. The gesture of a man who wanted Nolan to see that he had access to a line and was deciding whether to use it. Put it down, Nolan said. I have an arrangement. I know what arrangement you have. I know what you're holding, and I know who gave it to you, and I know what the trigger condition is. Nolan looked at him without blinking. What I need you to understand is that the trigger condition is no longer operative, because Marek Vale is no longer in a position to receive a response from you. He paused. So whatever you think that phone does for you right now, reconsider. Casson's hands lowered slightly. Not all the way. But the calculation in his face was shifting, the specific arithmetic of a man who built his entire contingency around one variable and is now watching that variable change in real time. Where is Marek? Casson said. That depends on the next 20 minutes. Nolan moved past him into the main room. A sitting room, deep-chaired, a fireplace with no fire, a low table with a laptop open on it, and beside the laptop a hard drive of the kind that held a lot of data and took up very little space. He looked at the drive. Then he looked at Casson. Is that it? Casson said nothing. The documentation package, the offshore accounts, the 3 years of records. Nolan gestured at the drive on the table. Is that the copy he gave you? Casson's jaw moved once. There are other copies. Of course there are. Marek is thorough. Nolan sat down in the chair across from the table. Not the intimidation of standing. He sat, which was the pressure of someone who intends to still be in the room after the other person's current plan has run its course. But you are the fail-safe. You're not the only copy, but you're the one he trusts to deploy it correctly. You're the one who knows what correctly means. He held Cassin's gaze. Sit down, Philip. Cassin sat. Tell me about the arrangement. A long silence. The particular silence of a man measuring how much he has already lost against how much more he stands to lose if he misjudges the room. He came to me 4 years ago, Cassin said finally. I'd done work for him before. Legitimate work, estate planning, a corporate restructure. He said he had a situation that required a particular kind of management, long term. He said he needed someone who understood the value of documentation and who could be trusted to act on specific instructions at a specific time. A pause. The financial arrangement was significant. What were the instructions? If I received a specific message from him, a code phrase, 3 words, sent from a particular number, I was to deploy the package to a list of addresses he provided. Federal, municipal, financial press. Cassin looked at the hard drive. If he went more than 30 days without contact, same deployment. And if he contacted you to stand down, same code phrase, different channel. He looked at Nolan. If you found me, he hasn't sent the stand down. He hasn't had time. Nolan looked at the drive. And he won't. The sentence sat in the room. Cassin was very still. You're going to? I'm going to handle Marek. Nolan's voice was completely even. What happens to you depends on what you do in the next 2 minutes. You give me the drive and every other copy location you know about. You walk away from the Varric Association permanently, and I don't surface the 14 months of Port Authority interference that Pharaoh documented for me yesterday. He held Cassin's eyes. Or you make that call and find out how quickly a situation escalates when the person you were relying on doesn't respond. The fireplace was cold. The room smelled of old books and the particular staleness of a space where someone had been sitting with their anxiety for several hours, generating heat and not opening windows. Cassin's hands were on his knees. He looked at the hard drive, then at Nolan, then at the phone, which was on the arm of his chair. He picked up the phone. Nolan didn't move. Cassin turned it off, set it face down on the table beside the drive. Then he reached into the drawer of the side table beside his chair and produced a second drive, smaller, a different brand, and set it next to the first. That's the backup, Cassin said. There's a cloud instance as well. I'll give you the credentials. Nolan looked at the 2 drives and thought about 3 years of Marek's careful documentation, the specific patience of it, the architecture of a betrayal that had been constructed with the same methodical competence as everything else Marek had ever built. He thought about a man who had watched him for 11 years and learned every angle of him and used that knowledge the way you use a map, to navigate around him, through him, in the dark. He picked up both drives. The credentials, he said. He was back in the car at 3:44. He called Clara first. She picked up immediately, same as before, and he said, Cassin is handled, and she exhaled once, a single breath, controlled, the kind that comes at the end of something sustained, and said, and Marek, and he said, not yet, and she said, where? And he said, I don't know yet, but I will. And she said, Cole is still here, and he said, I know, keep him there, and she said, Nolan, and he waited, and she said, be careful, and it was such a plain, direct thing, undecorated, that it sat in his chest in a place that nothing particularly plain and direct had sat in a very long time. He ended the call and sat in the back of the car and thought. Marek had left the building at 2:19. It was now 3:44. An hour and 25 minutes. He hadn't gone to Cassin's because Cassin had been alone and waiting and not expecting Marek. He hadn't left the city, not by any transportation method that Nolan's people could confirm in the time available, which was imperfect information, but enough to draw a working boundary. He hadn't reached out to any of the secondary contacts in the organization. Nolan's network had been monitoring for that since 2:30. He was somewhere in the city, with his jacket missing, with the phone that Nolan's monitoring system had last pinged at 227 near Michigan Avenue and had gone dark after battery pulled, or a second phone, or a Faraday envelope of the kind that Marek had once shown Nolan as a demonstration of a technique they were discussing years ago in a context neither of them would have described as relevant at the time. He was somewhere Nolan knew. That was the logic Nolan kept returning to. Marek was a man who operated in known terrain. He didn't improvise space. He pre-positioned it. The same way he'd pre-positioned Cassin. the same way he'd positioned the financial documentation over 3 years. Somewhere in Chicago, there was a location Marek had prepared for exactly this contingency, and it was a location that Nolan's people hadn't surfaced because it wasn't connected to anything in the official network. He thought about 11 years of known terrain. He thought about a city that they'd both moved through for so long that the map of it was identical in both their heads. Same streets, same buildings, same weight of history attached to specific corners and rooms and parking structures. He thought about a bar on the near north side that they'd used in the early years. Not a meet location, just a place they'd ended up in a handful of times after hard nights. A place that didn't have cameras on the back entrance because the owner had made an arrangement years ago and never updated the security system. A place where Marek had once sat for 4 hours after a specific event in the organization's early history that neither of them had named since. A place that Nolan had not thought about in years but that existed in the map the same way all the early terrain existed, as a known landmark, an established coordinate. A place that was, above everything else, private. He gave Reyes the address. The bar was called Linden's and it opened at noon, and it was the kind of establishment that attracted a particular clientele. Not rough, not upscale, just invisible. The specific invisibility of a place that had been in the same location for 30 years and had achieved the urban camouflage of something too established to be interesting. The back entrance was off an alley that ran between Linden's and a dry cleaner that closed at 3. Nolan told Reyes to park at the alley's mouth and wait. He went in the back. The rear door opened into a short hallway with a storeroom on one side and the door to the main bar on the other, and a single overhead light that had been 40 watts for as long as Nolan had known this building. He pushed through the door to the bar. It was quiet. A bartender at the far end who looked up and then looked away with the professional discretion of a man who'd been in this business long enough to know which faces required that response. 3 other patrons spread across the room, none of them Marek. Nolan stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he looked at the corner booth, the one in the back left, the one that faced the room and had the wall on 2 sides and the exit 3 steps away. The corner booth was empty, but the glass on the table had something in it, and the glass was not empty. Nolan crossed the room and sat down in the corner booth, across from the empty seat, and picked up the glass. Bourbon. Neat. Half full or half empty. He'd never had patience for that particular philosophical position. He set it back down. He waited. 4 minutes. The back door opened behind the bar, through the kitchen, through the service corridor, and Marek came in. He was still in his work clothes minus the jacket, the dark suit, the white shirt open at the collar now, the reading glasses gone. He looked, for the first time in Nolan's recent memory, like a man who was carrying his age. Not broken, Marek would not break in any way that showed, but compressed, the way metal compresses under sustained load, the grain of it becoming visible. He looked at Nolan sitting in his booth. He sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The bar's ambient noise, low music, the bartender moving glasses, one of the other patrons watching something on his phone, filled the space between them with the ordinary texture of a world that did not know what was sitting in the corner booth. "You were always going to find this place," Marek said. "Yes, I knew that." He looked at the bourbon, didn't pick it up. "I knew you'd find it, and I came here anyway." He looked at Nolan. "I think I wanted you to find it. Tell me why." "Because the alternative was—" He stopped, looked at his hands on the table, flat, still, the discipline of them. "The alternative was disappearing into a city I don't know, with money that doesn't feel like anything, and spending the rest of my life being careful in a way that had no purpose." A pause. "I've been careful for 40 years. It was always for something. The money alone isn't—" He stopped again. "Say it," Nolan said. "It's not enough." Marek's voice was absolutely flat. 4.3 million and no organization and no city and no... He stopped. "I built this with you. 20 years. I built every piece of it. The architecture, the network, the specific configuration of everything you have. I built half of it. And I watched you take the credit for all of it because that's the structure. That's how it works. And I accepted that because the structure worked and the structure was mine as much as yours. And then you, He stopped. "Then I what?" Nolan said quietly. Mark was looking at the table. You started to change, in ways I couldn't predict. The extra variable, the careful decisions, and I thought you were going soft in a way that would break the structure. And then I realized you weren't going soft. You were adding something, building something different. He paused. And I wasn't in it. The bar was quiet around them. You could have said that to me, Nolan said. I don't say things like that. Mark's voice was completely even. Neither do you. That's not the language we use. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. The man across from him was, and had been for 20 years, the most operationally competent person he'd ever known. He was also, Nolan understood now, with the particular clarity that comes too late, one of the most isolated. Not lonely. Mark would reject that word, had probably never applied it to himself. Just without a variable. Without the thing that made the structure mean something beyond its own function. He'd spent 4 years watching Nolan develop that variable, and he'd called it weakness, and moved against it, and in doing so had revealed more precisely than anything else could have that he understood exactly what it was and could not tolerate it. The documentation, Nolan said. All of it. Everything Casson had and everything else. I need it gone, Marek. Every copy. Every instance. You know why. Clara, Marek said. Partly. Nolan held his gaze. And partly because if it surfaces, it doesn't only destroy me. It destroys everything we built, together. Every piece of it. Mark was quiet. You want me to give you a clean exit, Nolan said. Tell me where the remaining copies are, and I'll give you exactly what you asked for on the phone. You leave. You don't come back. I don't come after you. He paused. You have my word. Something moved in Marek's face. The specific thing that moved there was not easy to name. It was the particular expression of a man receiving something he calculated he would never receive and discovering that the calculation was wrong. Your word, Marek said. The way he said it was not sarcastic. It was the way a man says a thing he's been holding in low regard for a long time and is now, unexpectedly, re-examining. Yes, a silence. Mark looked at the bourbon, picked it up, finished it in one movement, set the glass down. There's a safe deposit box, he began. He didn't finish the sentence because the back door opened again, not from the kitchen this time, from the rear hallway entrance, the door from the alley, and 2 men came through it, and neither of them was Reyes. Nolan was on his feet before his mind fully articulated the problem. The first man was in dark clothing and had the build of someone whose job was physical and who had been doing it long enough that it had become his resting state. Broad, fast, no hesitation. The second man was slightly behind him and had something in his hand that was not a glass. Marek stood too, half a second behind Nolan, and in the fraction of that gap, Nolan had time to look at his face and confirm the one thing he needed to confirm. The genuine shock there. The way Marek's body had gone to a specific kind of stillness that was not the stillness of a man who had expected company. He hadn't sent them, which meant someone else knew about this location. Someone else who had been watching Marek the way Nolan had been watching Marek, but from a different direction, for a different reason, with a different... Someone else who had been watching Marek the way Nolan had been watching Marek, but from a different direction, for a different reason, with a different endgame entirely. The first man cleared the hallway in 4 steps. Nolan moved left, not back, never back, left and into the man's angle rather than away from it, which was the counterintuitive geometry of someone who'd learned a long time ago that retreat was the slowest direction. He caught the man's leading arm at the wrist and used the momentum of the approach rather than fighting it, turning it outward, leveraging the weight of someone who'd committed to a line and couldn't change it. There was a sound. Not clean, not the sound of controlled training, but the wet mechanical sound of a joint pushed past its tolerance. The man made a noise and his grip opened and Nolan moved through the space where the grip had been. Behind him, he heard Marek. Not running. Marek didn't run. He heard the specific sounds of Marek engaging the second man, which were shorter and more efficient than they would have been from anyone else, because Marek at 50 in a bar on the north side was still Marek, was still the man who had been Nolan's enforcer before he was anything else, was still built around a specific ruthless competence that 11 years of administration had not softened in any functional way. The second man had a telescoping baton. He'd gotten one strike in before Mark took it from him. Nolan knew this without looking because of the sound of the strike, which connected somewhere, and then the different sound of metal hitting the floor and not being picked up by the person who dropped it. The first man came back. He was bigger than his partner, and he was angry in the specific way of someone who'd underestimated an opponent and was recalibrating without slowing down, which made him fast but predictable. Nolan took a hit to the left shoulder, solid, the kind that would deaden the arm for 60 seconds, and came back with something that wasn't elegant and didn't need to be. The bar stool between them resolved the question. The man went down against the side of the booth and stayed down. Nolan stood. His shoulder was singing. His breathing was ragged at the edges, and he pulled it back into control by force of will, standing in the middle of Lyndon's bar on a Tuesday afternoon with two unconscious men on the floor, and the bartender somewhere behind the bar, and the three patrons who had been here when he arrived now conspicuously absent, which told him the back door had been opened at some point in the last 90 seconds, by people who recognized the sound of a situation that was not their business. Mark was standing near the hallway entrance. The second man was on the floor at his feet. Mark had his right hand pressed against his left side, not dramatically, just the specific pressure of someone containing a problem until they can evaluate it. His face was entirely blank. The reading glasses had somehow survived, still in his breast pocket. "Who sent them?" Nolan said. His voice came out even. His shoulder disagreed. "Hendricks," Mark said. The name landed in the room with the weight of something Nolan should have seen sooner. Hendricks, the deal from 6 months ago, the one Clara had made him reconsider, the clean move he hadn't taken. Gerald Hendricks ran a financial services group that had been attempting to acquire leverage over Varick Capital's port operations for 2 years. Nolan had blocked him at every angle. The deal 6 months ago had been the cleanest opportunity Hendricks had created, and Nolan, with the extra variable that Marek had cataloged and resented, had chosen caution. Hendricks had been watching Marek, had identified him as the inside fault line before Nolan had been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment when Marek broke loose from the organization, when the fracture was fresh and the chaos was maximum, to clean up both of them simultaneously. "He approached you," Nolan said. 3 weeks ago. Mark's hand was still on his side. "He said he knew about the documentation. He wanted a copy. I told him I'd consider it." A pause. "I didn't agree." But he didn't believe that. "Clearly not." Mark looked at the man on the floor, then at Nolan. "He sent a cleanup crew. Handles me and you in one location, recovers whatever I'm carrying, surfaces the documentation himself." He exhaled once. Tidier than I would have been. Nolan looked at Mark's left side. "How bad?" "The first strike connected. It's nothing structural." "Let me see." "It's nothing structural, Nolan." They looked at each other. Two men in their 40s in a bar with two bodies on the floor and a decade of broken trust between them and the specific absurdity of an argument about whether a wound needed examination. Something moved in the air between them that was not quite humor, was adjacent to it, the dark cousin of it, the kind of thing that two people who have been through enough together can access even in the worst moments. Nolan looked away first. "We need to move." "Yes, Reyes is at the alley mouth. There's a clinic 3 blocks. I don't need a clinic. Marek, I don't need a clinic." His voice was final, not defensive, just the flat declarative of a man who had decided. "I need to finish the conversation we were having." The bar was very quiet. The low music had stopped at some point. The speaker system on a timer, or someone had killed it remotely. The overhead lights felt brighter than they had before, the room stripped of its ambient texture by the abrupt end of the ordinary Tuesday that had been happening in it. "The safe deposit box," Nolan said. Mark reached into his jacket pocket. The jacket was missing, but the suit jacket had an interior pocket, and produced a key. Small, brass, the standard kind. He set it on the bar beside him. "First National on LaSalle, box 417 is everything in it. The full documentation set, the account structures, 3 years of records." He looked at the key. The cloud instance Casson had was a partial set. The box has the complete archive. He paused. "There's nothing else. No other copies. I built it to be singular. Distributed copies create distributed risk. One location, one key, one person who knows. He looked at Nolan. Now two. Nolan looked at the key for a moment. Then he picked it up. The names Hendricks used, Nolan said. Whoever he sent to watch you. I need them. Mark told him two names in the flat, precise way he always gave operational information. No context, no decoration, just the data. Nolan committed them without writing them down, the same way he'd always committed names, because the habit of never having a list was older than any other habit he had. The man on the floor near the booth shifted. Not conscious, just the involuntary movement of a body resettling itself. Nolan looked at him. They had 20 minutes before this location became complicated. Go, Mark said. Nolan looked at him. Mark was standing beside the bar with his hand still pressed to his side and his face carrying the compressed, specific exhaustion of a man who has been running a performance for 4 years and has just, in the last 40 minutes, stopped. He looked older than he had this morning, not broken. Nolan had said that to himself before, and it was still true, but depleted in a way that was its own kind of honest. The exit I promised you, Nolan said. I know. It holds. Nolan met his eyes. You have my word. It holds. Merrick looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man encountering something he'd written off as a category that no longer existed. He nodded once, the specific small nod that meant, in the language they'd built over 20 years, that the matter was settled and would not be revisited. There's an account, Mark said, separate from the 4.3. It's clean. No Varick connection, no documentation trail. It has enough. He paused. I built it for this. I've been building it since before I started the other. A pause. I knew, eventually, it would come to this. Where will you go? Somewhere without a winter. The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The remnant of an expression that had been more available in a younger version of this man. I'll figure it out. Nolan nodded. He picked up the bourbon glass from the table, the one Marek had emptied, and set it back in the center of the table with the particular precision of someone completing a gesture they couldn't fully explain. Then he walked toward the back door. At the door he stopped, didn't turn around. Marek. Yeah. The men in the parking garage, the ones who put their hands on her. He kept his voice even, purely informational. Where? A pause. Gary. There's a freight management company. The same terminal on the logistics report I was reviewing. They run errands for hire. The broad one is named Solis, Ben Solis, the same name Pharaoh gave you. He freelances for whoever needs him. Another pause. The short one I don't know. Nolan opened the door. Nolan. Marek's voice behind him, quiet, flat, carrying something that was not apology because Marek didn't have that particular word in his vocabulary, but was its functional equivalent. Nolan waited. She was right not to give them the drive, Marek said. Tell her, Bo, she was right. He went out into the alley. Bombant. The drive to the penthouse took 19 minutes in traffic that had thickened into the early edge of the evening commute. Nolan sat in the back of the car with the brass key in his jacket pocket and his left shoulder starting to produce a dull, sustained roar that was going to be worse tomorrow than it was now. And he looked at the city going past in the gray late afternoon light and felt the specific weight of a day that had been, in its duration of less than 36 hours, several decades long. He called Clara at 4:41. It's done, he said. A silence. Then, Marek. He's gone. He'll be out of the country by morning. Nolan looked at a stoplight. Hendricks sent people to the bar. Cleanup operation. Her breath changed, just slightly, the controlled intake of someone processing a threat that has already passed but whose proximity is still being absorbed. Are you? I'm fine. Shoulder. Nothing. Nolan. I'm fine, Clara. He paused. I'm coming to you. Another silence. Shorter. The particular quality of a silence that is not empty. Okay, she said. He put the phone in his pocket and watched the city and thought about Gerald Hendricks and the two names Marek had given him and the specific, unhurried way in which those two threads would need to be resolved in the coming days, cleanly, completely, with the particular administrative thoroughness that had kept his world intact for 20 years. He thought about Pharaoh, who would spend the next several years being professionally cooperative and personally miserable. He thought about Casson, who would spend the same period doing whatever lawyers did when the architecture of their secondary life had been quietly dismantled. He thought about a bar on the north side and a man without his jacket setting a bourbon glass on a table. He didn't think about Marek the way he'd thought about betrayal in the abstract, the cold structural weight of the load-bearing wall that had been load-bearing for nothing. He thought about him the way you eventually think about things that have cost you and cannot be recovered, with a kind of flat, honest grief that didn't require performance and didn't require resolution, just acknowledgement. It happened. It cost what it cost. The building was still standing. He thought about whether that was enough. He was still thinking about it when the car stopped in front of the penthouse building. Cole opened the door before Nolan knocked. "Clean all day," Cole said. He was reading Nolan's shoulder in the way of someone who had been in enough situations to understand the specific tilt of a man carrying an impact injury. "You need ice." "I need to see Clara." Cole stepped back. She was at the kitchen island. Of course she was. Where else? With the laptop open and a glass of water at her elbow and her hair still loose from the night before, which he was going to stop registering as significant and hadn't managed to yet. She looked up when he came through the door, and her face went through several things in very quick succession. Relief, assessment, the specific inventory of someone checking for damage before they allow themselves to feel the relief properly. He looked, he knew, like a man who'd had a difficult afternoon. The shoulder was visible in how he was carrying himself. There was a cut on his right hand he hadn't noticed until now. His suit had not survived the day. She came around the island. She didn't say anything. She took his right hand, the cut one, and turned it over and looked at it, and the bruise on her forearm was directly adjacent to the cut on his palm, and they stood in the kitchen of the penthouse in the late afternoon while the city went about its ordinary business 40 floors below, and something about the specific geometry of that, 2 sets of damage, proximate, held lightly, broke something open in Nolan's chest that the violence of the afternoon had not. "It's shallow," she said, about the cut. "I know." "You should still clean it." "I know." She looked up from his hand. Her eyes were very direct, not performing anything, not the careful professional adjacency she'd maintained for 2 years. Just her, looking at him from a distance of approximately 14 inches, with a face that had been through a great deal in the last 24 hours, and was still, somehow, entirely itself. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her. All of it. Casson, the drives, Lyndon's bar, Mark's face when the 2 men came through the door, the key, the names, the final exchange at the back door. He told it the way he told operational accounts, precise, sequenced, without ornamentation. But he did not keep his voice at its operational register the entire time, and at certain points it dropped into something lower, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd cataloged about her in 2 years, that she listened with her whole attention and didn't fill space that wasn't hers to fill. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He told you where the men were," she said. "The ones from the garage." "Yes." "You're going to handle that." "Yes." She nodded once. Not approval, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The acknowledgement of a woman who understands the world she has chosen to remain in and who is not pretending otherwise. "He said to tell you," Nolan said, "that you were right not to give them the drive." She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not what he expected, which would have been a kind of bitter satisfaction. What moved there was quieter than that. More considered. She looked at the window. "He's not wrong about everything, then," she said. "No." Nolan set the key from the safe deposit box on the counter between them. "Tomorrow morning, First National, on LaSalle. I need you with me." She looked at the key. "The complete documentation archive. Everything Marek built over 3 years. We go through it, verify it's complete, and then we determine what to do with it." He paused. "Some of it will be useful. Some of it needs to disappear entirely. And the offshore accounts it documents. Get restructured, all of them, starting next week." He held her gaze. "That's a longer process. But it starts." She was looking at him in the particular way she'd been looking at him since this morning. The ongoing revision, the model of him that kept requiring updates. You were already planning to restructure them, she said slowly, before any of this. He didn't answer immediately. The audit you told Marek about, she said. The one that was starting next month. Was it real? It was real, he said. I initiated it. You initiated your own audit of your own offshore structures. I've been building toward it for 2 years. He looked at the key on the counter. The empire I have now is not the empire I want to have in 10 years. The restructuring has been in process. It's slow. It's complicated. He paused. It required a level of trust in my operational foundation that I believed I had. She absorbed this. Marek knew. Marek saw the direction. He didn't know the full timeline. Nolan's voice was even. He thought I was going soft. He couldn't see that the structure was changing because I'd decided to change it, not because of anything that had compromised me. He looked at her. He couldn't see that because he'd already decided what the change meant before he looked at it. Clara was very still. He was wrong, she said. Yes. And what he said to you on the phone, the extra variable, the careful decisions. She held his gaze. He was right about those. Nolan said nothing. He was right that something changed, she said. He was wrong about what it meant. She looked at the key, then back at him. I've been in this building for 2 years. I've watched you run this organization. I've processed every document, scheduled every meeting, transferred every file you've asked me to touch. Pause. I'm not naive about what the organization is. I know you're not. And I'm still here. The sentence sat between them with a weight that was entirely different from any of the other sentences the day had produced. Not dramatic, just present, just true. He looked at her for a long time. The loose hair, the bruised jaw, which was darker now than this morning, which would be worse tomorrow before it was better. The forearm, the careful way she held herself around the bruised ribs, the breath management she'd been doing for 36 hours without complaint. He said, "What do you want, Clara?" The question surprised her. He could see it, the slight widening, the recalibration. People didn't ask her that generally, or if they did, they asked it in the way of someone who expected a professional answer, a deliverable, a task. He meant it without any of that framing, and she understood that he did, and the understanding of it made her look away briefly, not from discomfort, but from the specific reaction of someone receiving a thing they hadn't prepared for. She looked back. I want to finish what we started, she said. The restructuring, the audit, all of it. She held his gaze steadily. I want to be part of that, not as your secretary, not as someone you protect and keep in a penthouse while the actual work happens. She paused, as the person who helps you build what comes next. He was quiet. And I want, she said more quietly, to stop pretending that what is true between us is not true. The room held the sentence. Nolan looked at her, at the face he'd been cataloging for 2 years with the careful, deliberate non-acknowledgement of a man who had decided, for reasons that had made sense at the time, that some doors were better left with their handles removed. He thought about Marek calling it softness. He thought about what it had actually been. Not softness, not compromise, not the degradation of the structure he'd built. Something else. Something that had been growing in the space beside the structure, patient and unasked for, that he'd been pretending he couldn't see. He reached out and touched her face, very lightly, just the edge of his thumb against the unbruised side of her jaw, a touch so careful it barely qualified as one. She didn't move away. I'm not, he said slowly, an easy thing to be beside. I know what you are. She said it without flinching. I've been reading your files for 2 years. Something moved in him that was entirely new, or not new, but newly allowed, which amounted to the same thing. He almost smiled. Didn't quite, but the almost of it was visible, and she saw it, and he watched her see it with the specific expression of someone who has been waiting, without quite admitting it, for a version of him to become available. He lowered his hand. Tomorrow, he said. First National, 8 o'clock. I'll be ready. And tonight you sleep. The ribs are bruised, she said, with the flat certainty of someone who has had this conversation once already and considers it settled. Need rest, he finished, as if she hadn't spoken. And you've been awake for 37 hours. She looked at him. So have you. I'm going to deal with 2 things, he said. Then I'll sleep. The names Marek gave you. One of them needs a call tonight, the other can wait until morning. He picked up the brass key and held it for a moment. The weight of it, which was nothing, a few grams of ordinary metal and everything at once, and then set it back on the counter between them. This doesn't leave the building. I know. Cole appeared in the doorway briefly, read the room with the professional speed of someone who had been reading rooms for Nolan Varick for a very long time, and disappeared without speaking. Nolan looked at the window. The city in the early evening, the light changing, the commute thinning, the particular quality of a Tuesday becoming a Tuesday night. Chicago settling into itself with the exhausted, ordinary rhythm of a city that had no idea what had happened inside it today. The port, the boardroom, the bar. All of it invisible from 40 floors up, all of it absorbed into the texture of the city's continuous noise. He thought about Marek somewhere in this city tonight, making arrangements, moving money, booking something, choosing a direction. He thought about the specific loneliness of that, not with satisfaction, not with the clean feeling of a concluded account, but with the complicated truth of it. A man he had known for 20 years choosing a direction that went away from everything they'd built, for reasons that were both unforgivable and, in some register, he was only now beginning to access, comprehensible. He'd been wrong about Marek in the specific way you're wrong about the people you trust completely. Not about the fact of the trust, but about what the trust could bear. He'd assumed that the structure of their working relationship was also the structure of their understanding of each other. He'd confused operational fluency for actual knowledge. That was his error. He owned it. He wouldn't make it again. The call took 20 minutes. The name Marek had given him, the first one, the more urgent one, was a contact inside the Hendricks organization who had been funneling location data on Nolan's movements. The call was not to that contact. The call was to someone in Hendricks's orbit who had been for 3 years in a quiet arrangement with Varick Capital, one of the lateral relationships that Nolan maintained in the gray space between opposition and alliance. The specific architecture of a city where enemies were often separated from allies by nothing more than current alignment of interest. He spoke for 8 minutes, listened for 5, concluded in 3. When he ended the call, Gerald Hendricks had 24 hours to make a decision that would determine the next several years of his professional life. Nolan had laid out the decision with the same precision he'd used on Pharaoh and with the same quiet certainty. Not a threat exactly. A door. The door was open. What Hendricks brought through it was his own choice. Nolan stood at the window after the call and looked at the lake. Black water, lit at the edges by the city's ambient light, stretching out to a horizon he couldn't see. He'd stood at this window dozens of times, this penthouse, this view, and it had always been what it was, a position, a vantage, the view from the top of a structure he'd spent 20 years building. Tonight, it looked different, not smaller, not less, just oriented differently, aimed at something he hadn't been aiming at before or had been aiming at without fully acknowledging the target. He heard her behind him, the specific sound of her moving carefully through the kitchen, accommodating the ribs, the quiet competence of a woman doing everything at a slightly modified angle and not making it anyone else's concern. The sound of water. A glass. He turned around. She was at the kitchen sink with a glass of water and her back to him, looking at the counter, and she was doing the thing he'd watched her do at her desk 100 times. She was thinking, her whole body slightly stilled by the weight of whatever was running through her mind, her left hand resting on the edge of the counter the way she rested it on the edge of her desk when a problem was still unresolved. "Clara," he said. She turned. "Fensolis," he said, "the freight company in Gary. I need you to know that it's being handled. Tonight." She looked at him for a moment. "How?" "The way things like this are handled." He held her gaze. "Not the way the men in the parking garage handled it. Cleanly." A pause. "You won't hear about it. You won't need to." She absorbed this. He watched her process the specific texture of the world she had chosen to remain inside. The knowledge of what handled meant, the clean and the otherwise, the specific distance between the official empire and the other one. He watched her decide something. "All right," she said. It was the same 2 words as in the car last night, the same weight, the same deliberate, unconditioned yes. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. the same distance as the kitchen earlier, 14 inches. The particular proximity they'd been managing all day with the accumulated awareness of people who are pretending not to be managing anything. He took her left hand, the bruised arm, carefully, below the bruise, and held it. Just held it. His hand around hers, the cut on his palm against the back of her hand. Two kinds of damage in contact, neither of them pretending it was anything other than what it was. She looked at their hands, then at him. "No one touches you again," he said. "Not a performance, not the announcement of a position or the declaration of a territorial claim. Just the plain, absolute truth of a man who has arrived, through a long and expensive route, at a sentence he intends to spend the rest of his life keeping." She looked at him for a long moment. In her face was everything the day had put there. The exhaustion, the pain managed down to a low constant, the specific gravity of a woman who had come to work 36 hours ago with a handprint on her arm and had decided, by coming, by staying, by building the trap, and holding the door and saying, all right, without conditions, exactly who she was. She turned her hand over in his so that their palms were together. "I know," she said. Outside, the city continued its business. Rain had started again, soft this time. The kind that didn't attack, just arrived, covering the lake and the glass towers and the ordinary streets with the quiet, indifferent patience of weather that had nothing to prove. In the bar on the north side, two men were having a conversation with Cole about what they would remember and what they would not. On LaSalle Street, a safe deposit box sat undisturbed in the dark of a vault, its brass key in the jacket pocket of a man who was going to change what it contained into something that served a different purpose. In Gary, Indiana, a freight company was going to have a difficult night. In a penthouse 40 floors above Chicago, a man who had been built from concrete and violence was holding a woman's hand in a kitchen, and neither of them was speaking, and the silence was the best kind. The kind that doesn't need to be filled because everything necessary has already been said, and what remains is only the work of living up to it. Tomorrow would come with its own weight. The audit, the restructuring, the long, complicated process of changing an empire from the inside out, which was slower and harder and more uncertain than building one had ever been. There would be other Hendrixes. There would be other nights like this one, other decisions made at the edge of everything, other prices paid in rooms that the world never saw. But tonight the rain was soft and the city was lit, and Nolan Varick stood in his kitchen with blood on his collar and a woman beside him who had looked at everything he was and chosen to stay. And he was not, in this moment, the most dangerous man in Chicago. He was only a man, and for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.